Okay, you just had a baby, Kaitzak, basically, together.
Obviously, Mariam and I are married. We want to put our best foot forward, not only for our marriage, but for Kaitzak too.
Andre was talking about, starting our own project and initiating something of our own.
Obviously, it's important to have milestones and goals, but obsessing over that versus the actual work means that you're actually missing the point of why we're doing all of this.
Kaitzak sort of became this practical implementation device for the things that we're learning and studying at universities.
I feel like I have homes in different places, but none of the places is home.
I would say lifestyle wise, it's just different. It's a lot more driving. So I think it's more like a commuting thing that's different.
Andre, Mariam, thank you so much for being here. I appreciate you being on the Soulful Entrepreneur podcast and talk a little bit about the story of Kaitzak.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah. So I want to start by addressing the elephant in the room, at least for me, which is you two are married and you founded Kaitzak together. And my first question, how does that work? How does the relationship dynamic between two people who are married and also founded an initiative together, how does that work? Do you fight a lot? Any scoops?
So first of all, great question. I'm sure a lot of people are wondering that. A few pieces here. One is, I think something that really helps us is having a set time. So we actually set meetings. We'll set like Kaitzak touch base, and we come together and we give each other updates. We sort of say like, okay, this is what I'm working on. What are you working on? Which really helps to have like a designated time where we can discuss things. But we, like you said, we are a married couple, and we also don't only talk about it in the meetings. So there will be times where we don't agree about things. We have to give each other feedback. These are all stuff that, and it's an important component of building something together. It's about like learning how to give each other feedback, learning how to disagree. I think something that we do to ameliorate this a little bit is we don't make any rash decisions. No one person is making one final decision, and we try to give ourselves time to come back and discuss things. So that really helps us. But ultimately, there are moments where small things can turn into like little silly, how do we design this thing or that thing? But I think it is important to sort of like look at the larger picture, which we ultimately do. We try to like zoom out, and then something that Andre is actually really good at is, if one of us is initiating an idea, it's like, let's make sure that there's a lot of excitement and energy about the fact that this thing is initiated, and not try to get down too clouded in the details and the weeds just yet, to give that space to grow into whatever it needs to grow into. So it's been interesting. I think we've learned a lot about each other, about how to work together, and there are moments where we're like, no, sorry, don't agree. But it's sort of learning about each other's styles of giving feedback and learning, and ultimately looking at like the larger picture of what we're moving towards.
Yeah, definitely. I think, well, I'm an architect by profession, so I can be a bit sensitive to subjectivity, and I'm doing a lot of the design stuff, and so we're learning to have conversations on subjective topics and like how to communicate without sounding rash or insulting or anything like that. So that's been, I think, in a way that sort of feeds back into our relationship too. So it's actually pretty good. It gives us more territory to cover as a couple and to overcome. So I think that's really nice that we can do it. And there's the one other thing that I think we try to focus on is to make sure that people, so right now it's Mariam and I, But previously we did have some other people that were helping us right at the beginning, and we tried to give people a lane and give them sort of full accountability of that lane. So a very important part of Kaitzak is its structure, which is if you are accountable for something, it's fully yours, and there's no top-down hierarchy. There's no like CEO at the top that can oversee and can make decisions for everyone. It's like you set your own agenda. Let's say I'm doing podcasts, for example. I set the podcast agenda, and then I can take my ideas to the rest of the group, get their input, and then I can make the final decision. But I need to be able to also self-start, take that work forward, and not wait for someone to come and kick me up the backside and be like, hey, why haven't you done anything, blah, blah, blah. So we're really avoiding that top-down hierarchy, which in a way, using these more recent technology or like theories of governance really, really like seeps into the culture and the way we interact and how positively we can sort of move into the future. So obviously Mariam and I are married. We want to put our best foot forward, not only for our marriage, but for Kaitzak too, because that's the same, it's the same dynamics that we're covering, just in a, slightly different setting. So Kaitzak needs to be the best it can be from a structure and governance perspective. And yeah, the relationship, I think, really strongly influences the motivation to make sure it's the best it can be.
That's interesting. I feel like a couples therapist now. But tell me, have you learned anything new about one another? Anything that strikes you of, oh, I didn't know about this about Andre, or I didn't know this about Mariam?
You don't have to be nice. You can
like, which route do I take? The good one or the positive or negative?
The bad, the negative. No, I'm just kidding. Just do whatever.
Okay, the I'll say like Andre, working with him, he's really he says yes and. So if anyone has, like one of the key rules of improv is, if I go to him with an idea and I'm like, oh, I really want to start this thing, or I'm going to reach out to this person, or I'm doing this thing, he's always very excited or encouraging about it. He'll never just start picking at it or be like, well, why would you think to do such a thing? And something I've learned about him, which I think is reflective in our relationship too, is like he really values and admires agency and, that sort of incentive and someone starting something and initiating, even if it's not quite perfect, but the energy output, the arrow moving forward, he really admires that. And so I think just knowing that also allows me to be like, okay, if I have to go to him about something, I know if I have thought about it and I want something to move forward, he's going to respond positively to it. That's what I've learned about you.
Interesting. Yeah, no, that's very sweet. Thank you. Yeah, I think similarly with Mariam, initially, it was a bit, when you're starting something new, obviously that's the slowest and the hardest part. I think Mariam always had confidence that, this would be something important. And I could see that over time, she brought her own perspective and really, quite a sophisticated way, weaved it into Kaitzak's main objectives. So she managed to basically double the backing and the evidence-based and research-based stance that we're taking from her own field. So then I've like that really opened things up and opened my eyes. I was like, oh, this is amazing. Like I didn't even realize there was this whole other dimension to life that you could, this other lens that you could look at Kaitzak through. So she really, took this idea and just expanded it in a very positive way. So that was a big thing.
That's really cool. I think so. Two things we can pick out of this. One thing that you can tell me a little bit about the theory, maybe in a minute after we talk a bit about Kaitzak. But yeah, the other thing, I completely forgot what the other thing was. Yes, I just remembered. So you mentioned that she was confident that this is going to be a big thing, right? Which is a sign of a successful entrepreneur. Usually, I think Sam Altman was the one who said, if you are fully sure, if you need to have this self-confidence and unwavering belief that it will work out to be successful, something in those lines, which I think is super important for entrepreneurs, especially starting out. And as you know, it's like the first year, maybe 2 years, it's going to be super difficult. It's going to be a lot of ups and downs, and it's going to be like a lot of hesitation. So if you don't have that belief in the core that this is going to work out, it's going to be really tough. So I think that's an important thing to bring to the table.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, you just had a baby, Kaitzak, basically, together. So whose idea was it? Did you just sit down and decide, okay, let's work on this? Like, was this initially someone's idea, or how did this come to life?
Yeah, so I've been a pretty active part of the community, like the Armenian community in Sydney and Melbourne, being born in Sydney and then moving to Melbourne right before COVID. Just being in these community groups sort of taught me a few lessons that were really important, and the experiences sort of helped me identify gaps that exist here. And one of the really important gaps was young people being able to take ideas and take projects forward autonomously. For those who know me, you know, I have my own business now, and I reached a point where I struggle to take orders from people above, or that, you know, I was talking about that sort of hierarchical structure. It's a big feature of my life. I realized that there's no place for young people to belong to something without having to have a certain political ideology or feigning to have one, and without being in a religious context. So Kaitzak's, from a structural point of view, has to provide these things. So, and that feeds back into why, you know, we believe in this idea. It's like, this is something that's just fundamental to not only human experience, but to healthy and positive community building. And then the third thing was, and this is something derived like specifically from me, was creating a leadership example within our community that people could learn from. So if you're growing up in a certain group, that group's gonna, you know, give you their ideology. They're gonna be like, you know, you should think like this. These are the people you should spend time with. These are the people you shouldn't spend time with. Our approach was like, you need to have a group where you can go in and no one's going to tell you how to exist. It's like, we will stop things, you know, like obviously hate speech or nefarious people doing nefarious activities, but for the most part, it's up to the person to be able to decide what they want to do. So to bring it back to your question, which I haven't forgotten. So I saw that gap. I was working on these groups. I sort of kept trying to take projects to a certain point, and some committee would come over the top and stop it. I was like, I've had enough. I need to start my own thing. That was the initial idea. But then what really brought the meat into Kaitzak was so Mariam's positive psychology approach, so a strengths-based approach, and looking at community health. So that whole sort of fundamental grounding of Kaitzak came from that. And then the other perspective is from my end, which is the policy and the governance structures and how community groups are structured in order to enable health and enable flourishing. So that's sort of the inception, and it really took time to develop. So this idea, you know, was festering for a very, very long time. Right before moving to Armenia, we sort of brought it out, not officially, but like into the sphere of ideas. And then about a year ago, we really officially kicked things off once we understood what it is fundamentally and what the objective really is. So I think I sort of got it off the ground with some, you know, clunky vision. And then Mariam came in and we really were able to refine what it is and what we want to do.
Teamwork makes dream work. Mariam, do you have any ideas on that?
Yeah, I think you described it perfectly. I think the timing was interesting as well because we had sort of, which we'll talk about in a little bit as well, about moving to Armenia, but Andre was talking about, you know, starting our own project and in initiating something of our own. And I was still, you know, in that corporate structure. And last year when I was doing my master's of applied positive psychology at the University of Pennsylvania, I really started honing in on research on narratives, resilience, meaning making. So I was really interested in this idea of what stories diasporic groups, I specifically was looking at the Armenian diaspora in the United States, but what stories are being told in diaspora communities, why, and what benefit do they have? So do they actually promote our well-being as a collective, as individuals as well, or do they hinder it, right? Are they an obstacle? And so while we were talking about Kaitzak and launching something, we really also got excited about this idea of, you know, focusing on what's working in diasporic groups and building on that. And I think that's really what sets us apart from other organizations, platforms that exist out there, because it really is also a movement, right? It's not just about saying, okay, connect, amplify, flourish, which people might wonder what that means, but it really is inspired by that evidence-based approach, which is what positive psychology is, a science, right? It's the empirical study of human flourishing. So how we're able to combine that from that psychological lens and a policy lens, and ultimately not do it solely for theory, but do it to actually help people and communities. And that also involves talking to them, not telling people how they need to be to thrive.
Which, just very quickly, I think something that happened incidentally, but also drove Kaitzak's development in terms of our motivations, was what the way Mariam's saying is, Kaitzak sort of became this practical implementation device for the things that we're learning and studying at university. So it sort of supplemented these theories that we could be like, okay, well, we've learned so and so at uni. How does this actually work in real life? Which then hits this, you know, really sweet spot of research to you know, pragmatic use. So that was, I don't know if it's by accident or subconscious or whatever, it became like a very strong track for us to move forward on. And that helps with, you know, when you're talking about being an entrepreneur and dealing with the stresses and stuff, knowing that you have a track that goes on for potentially forever, you know, 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, that really gives you faith in understanding that there's no rush to do what you're doing. These things are important. They're empirically important. They're things that have been studied and researched for generations. It's a really good track to be on, and it really makes everything, I feel, everything that we do very intentional, because we're not like rushing to, you know, become superstars and become famous and have Kaitzak have 1 million followers and all these sorts of things. We're like, we actually really believe in this work. We know that whether it's today, whether it's tomorrow, whether it's 5 years, 10 years down the track, these things are going to have real impact. And yeah, that's really, really motivating.
Yeah, that's super cool. I was putting a video out about I don't know if you've read this before, the Bhagavad Gita, which talks about you need to only focus on the process and the work that you're doing. You have the right to only focus on the process and the work that you're doing, and not the fruit of their work, meaning that the journey is more important than the destination, as people always say that, and we take it for granted. We're like, it's just a cliche word, but it's so true. It brings so much presence to the work that people are doing if you're able to concentrate on how can I do this today, do this to the best of my abilities, and focus on the process and on enjoying today versus thinking about, ooh, I need to get to this milestone and I need to get famous and have millions views and stuff like that, which obviously it's important to have milestones and goals, but obsessing over that versus the actual work means that you're actually missing the point of why we're doing all of this. So I love that you brought that into the question. I love the evidence-based approach. I love the fact that you guys are so thoughtful about why you're doing this, how you're doing this, what is your goal, what is your purpose, what is your why, which is what Simon Sinek talks about, right? Start with a why, which I think you're doing it effectively, which is amazing. So I see the progression that Kaitzak will be taking in the next years. Like, it's evident. It's going to be upwards trajectory, obviously. But if you could explain to a 5-year-old, which is what my professor at Duke always asked me, if you could explain to a 5-year-old what Kaitzak is, how would you do it?
Yeah, you're way better at this. I get very confused very quickly.
She's going to use positive psychology on us right now.
I know we also speak differently. I realize when what we bring forward and highlight, but I think it's a good thing, what
it is
we
a good
sort
thing.
of bring forward. So Kaitzak, if it's just a general idea, if we're not getting into the nitty gritty, is supposed to be a place, a platform that allows for healthy and interconnected diaspora communities to form, learn about themselves, and flourish. So this is the overall gist of it. It's about creating and adding to the strengths and the connections that exist within and between diaspora communities globally. I think that's important to keep a worldwide global outlook. I don't know if a 5-year-old would understand 70% of those words, but let's make a happy world together. That's
okay. That makes sense. Yeah. Anything to add to that, Andre?
Let's be nice to each other.
Yeah. No, I think that the global piece is very important. It's understanding and, again, creating this story or this narrative for our diaspora that we do, even though by definition it's, fragmented, but realizing that we do have this cohesion around the globe, which is a very big positive to have. And not every community gets to have that, where we have very, very strong communities in lots and lots of different countries and cities all over the world. So just to supplement what Mariam's saying, it's like we want to make sure that those communities are as healthy as they can be, and those communities can teach each other how to be healthy and what's working and what's not working. Because I'm sure you've had this experience. We've been to a few summits and gatherings in Armenia, and you hear stories from people like in completely opposite side of the world, which is basically everywhere when you're in Australia. They're just like describing these problems that we're having, and you're like, damn, these guys are in a completely different cultural context, different group of people, blah, blah, but they're experiencing the exact same thing. Why don't we just figure this out together? Like, wouldn't that be a much easier thing to do? So that's my bit. Yeah.
So the problem being the division and the inability to connect, is that the problem that you're trying to solve with Kaitzak?
I think it's that we just haven't recognized the strength in that. It's just making sure that that's a thing that people can think globally. It's like, well, if I'm Armenian or I'm a diasporan, I can have this global perspective. And I can connect with people from countries I've never been in my life because I'm Armenian. I have language or culture or, all these ties that just are there by default. Why wouldn't I take advantage? Well, not by default, obviously hard work of parents, and don't want to undervalue that. But, growing up in Australia, I had, and it's very different to Mariam's story, which is another, even more sort of example of the complexity of the diaspora. I hadn't been to Armenia. My family hadn't been to Armenia until I first went when I was 20. My parents had never been there. My grandma hadn't even been there because of the genocide, obviously. So after I was a third generation to go back, and I was already in my early 20s. So that connection, even that diluted, was still strong enough to sort of bring things back together. Whereas Mariam, which is a lot of the diasporans I actually interact with, their parents lived in Armenia, and then they were born or they moved at a very young age or at some age out of Armenia and moved to another country. So these two different experiences, even though they're worlds apart, are still joining you in this global network of group of people that all belong together. And we just want people to think like that and make sure that they're considering that when they're deciding what to do with their lives. Like a young person's in Australia, they're like, oh, I've gone to uni and I'm going to work and I'm probably going to get married and have kids, blah, blah, blah. Like there's this track that's already set out for people. It's like, well, part of that track could be moving to another country and having a group that accepts you. It could be working overseas. Your story exemplifies something like that. It's like, how much can you gain from connecting to that global sphere? You could gain everything. Just need to think about it that way.
Yeah, I love that. Talk about your move to Armenia. I want to know why you guys decided to move to Armenia. What was this motivation to do that? And I'm assuming you already had jobs and a lot of responsibilities in Australia, and then you were rushed to move to Armenia. What was that about?
So I'll start this one because it makes sense timeline wise. I actually moved from New York City to Armenia. I moved in 2021, and so I lived in Armenia for 3 years after that until now we've moved to Australia. But I was born in Yerevan, and I moved to New York when I was 2 years old. But we went to Armenia almost every year. My parents were very very strategic and very devoted to keeping us connected to our roots. And I think as I got older, although it was hard, right? Because you grew up, I went to an international school, I had friends from all over the world, and it's difficult to feel that impact in your day-to-day when you're living in the diaspora as a kid, because there's so many things to think about your identity and language and whatnot. But ultimately, as I got older in my 20s, I was working in corporate, and as well, there was the pandemic happening and the 2020 Artsakh war, and this sounds intense, but I felt like my soul was decaying. So I think it was, why did you move to Armenia? My soul was decaying. I felt this feeling of hollowness. I felt that while things felt predictable, and I understand like the privilege of saying, things felt comfortable and predictable, because many people can't say that around the world. But my personal experience at that time was I did not feel that I was being challenged. I didn't feel that I was growing. And I felt this desire to be in Armenia and to be surrounded by people who cared about the same issues I cared about and felt, strongly about so many of the topics that I felt I struggled to connect with people in New York City at the time. About, and I have some really meaningful connections and some amazing friends in New York. But at that time, I felt that, my karmic destiny, my push as a human being to develop my soul, to develop my consciousness, the next level was to break out of that shell. So I moved to Armenia in 2021. I worked remote for a bit, and then I worked there for 2 years, and then I worked there for 1 year, and then step in Andre That's when I met him. I met him in Armenia.
Oh, okay. So you were not married prior to going to Armenia. So you met in Armenia. Amazing.
We met in Armenia. Yeah. So then I'll throw it over to him.
Yeah. How did you get this amazing lady? What did you do? What were the strategies? Let's divert our podcast completely.
It's like, this isn't actually about Kaitzak. This is about
exactly.
Yeah, no, I think similarly to Mariam, there was some sort of pull. As you were saying, there's a lot of things here that takes potentially decades to establish. Friendships, reputation, work, all these sorts of things, and I think it was a bit difficult for some people to understand why you'd want to move to Armenia. But I think for me it was I just started like a dream job at a developer in Melbourne, like the top of the building, like get to manage my own projects. I had a great manager. And in October 2020 2022 there was the sort of skirmishes reignited between Azerbaijan and Armenia. So the Azeris were attacking Armenia. And I sort of realized, I was like, well, I've always wanted to live there. It's sort of now or never. It's at a very, critical juncture. I think it's time to go. And, with my tail between my legs, I went to my manager and I was like, look, mate, I don't know how to explain this to you, but I'm moving to Armenia next week. Here's my letter of resignation. And they were super understanding, which was a huge shock. And to the point where, they basically didn't let me resign and put me on, some sort of unpaid leave just in case I changed my mind within a few months. So they made that much easier than, some of my closest friends and family, which is very, very funny. And yeah, just wanted to live in an environment surrounded by Armenians and to see what that was like. And obviously finding work and stuff can be tricky. So, that whole process of moving in, I struggled a lot, which Mariam could attest to. But it mostly had to do with who I decided to go to Armenia with. So who was my steward, which place I was working in. That made things very, very difficult. So that sort of made me realize, okay, there's something here that, needs some focus or some attention. And yeah, living there was, it's one of those things where it's like, if I hadn't moved there, I wouldn't have met Mariam. So that was a big one. We met at work, an in-person sort of experience there, which was, really good to be in the same building, but like far enough from each other that we weren't, like in each other's faces at all times. So that turned out to be, really positive. And basically learning, who you are in the Armenian context. And I feel like I learned about myself way more in that 2 years than I did my entire life living in Australia, like living in an Anglo-American, Anglo-Saxon country. So, yeah, and then moving back, obviously we figured things out and we decided that Australia was the place to be for the time being. But now I think the concept of permanence is lost. It's out the window. People are like, oh, you guys, you're back for good. And I'm like, well, I don't know.
Good.
Yeah, don't know what that means anymore. So we're sort of caught between, New York, Yerevan, and now Melbourne and Sydney. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, it's. I think it was karma that you two met in Armenia. Let's just put it that way.
Destiny was bringing us together from literally different sides of the world.
Exactly. First of all, who did you work for in Armenia?
We worked at TUMO, the TUMO Center in Yerevan.
And that's where you met. You met at TUMO. Oh,
yeah, we were at TUMO.
Yeah, TUMO is great. So I'm assuming you had a good experience working there, working at TUMO at least, because it's a very different organization from what the typical Armenian organizations are. I'm going to put it that way, not to offend anyone. Okay, so you met there, you came back to Australia, and that's when you decided to start Kaitzak, like right after you moved back to Australia.
So we were sort of we started in Armenia when I left Tumo to permanently focus on my own business, and that sort of opened up time to get Kaitzak really rolling. We're gonna have the official, like we've been working for about a year now, but we're gonna have the official launch finally because we wanted to do it in Australia in the next couple of months. So yeah, it's been going for a while, but it'll officially start in the next two or 3 months.
Nice. That's what I should do for my podcast too. Like, I haven't started yet. It's just I'm warming up. In 2 months, maybe. That's a pretty cool strategy. I like that. Mariam, when you moved to Australia, this was your first time coming to Australia, right? You were there before.
I visited Australia last year, mid my master's degree. Crazy year. He was in Armenia. I was flying back and forth between Philadelphia and Yerevan, and halfway through, Andre really wanted me to come meet his family here and to see Australia, see Sydney and Melbourne. And so I came here for like 10 days last year, which was really important because it allowed me to then move here for, again, we can't say for good because we don't know what permanence looks like anymore, but it allowed me to at least have an understanding of what life would potentially be like. So when we came this time, this was my like second official time coming here.
You have a culture shock is my question as you came to Australia and permanently started living there, permanently/temporarily.
Yes. I don't know if it was culture shock. I think there's more of a lifestyle shock, but I think at this point I wear so many culture hats, so to speak. So I don't even know which one I'm using when at this point. It's all meshed into one confused / flexible personality. So, I grew up in New York City, very intense, go, don't have any time for rest. If you do, you should still market that as part of your image. Oh, I do yoga and whatever, which I do, by the way. But moving to Armenia, a lot more focus on relationships, intergroup dynamics, all of these fun things. What does it look like to spend time with people, to be generous, to give them your time, your energy? And coming here, I wasn't quite sure where on that spectrum Australia would be. I think it definitely is more on that obviously Western sort of approach. Things are structured. I would say compared to New York City, people are their nervous systems are definitely more at ease. People's heart rates don't think they're as high as they would be on the East Coast. Everyone's really stressed out and paranoid. And so, look, I was one of those, and I'm still unlearning these things. But I would say lifestyle-wise, it's just different. It's a lot more driving. So I think it's more like a commuting thing that's different. So, just getting around, what your days look like. Right now where we're located, it's really beautiful. There's a lot of birds and plants, and I didn't grow up with that. So I'm personally very excited about that. So it's just been obviously starting over because I had to start over 3 years ago in Armenia, but I had more of I think I had like the support system and the cultural, I guess, input having been there so many times. So here my support system is all Andre, and it's all about, starting and learning again as you go. And I think as you get older, maybe it becomes a bit more challenging because we want to attach to what we know. But I think, again, it's good for one's own development to push yourself a bit, even in that challenge or that liminal transitional state, you can actually learn a lot about yourself and get some insights. So I think it's been a good way to develop that.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that. I whenever I travel, I just don't feel like I belong to any group. So it seems like to me, I don't know if you could relate to this, but I feel like I have homes in different places, but none of the places is home. That's exactly how I feel sometimes.
Definitely.
And it seems sad, but at the same time, I feel like, well, then I have to develop my own home inside myself. So just build that up and then be the structure that is moving throughout communities around the world. And, maybe that is the ideology that we should adopt because, yeah, it's a global world nowadays. So everyone is moving a lot.
Yeah. I love that. I love the home, inside yourself, because you can always return to yourself and you never really leave, hopefully. And
Yeah.
I think we should also, because this comes up so much, this comes up in, some of even the articles, the contributors that we have on Kaitzak as well, people are actually way more of that sentiment that they don't feel like they know where they belong, that there's no one definition of home. So I think we being the larger human collective conscience, I think, need to focus on redefining and normalizing that as an experience, because I don't know where we heard that you can only have one identity, one home, but everyone keeps feeling that they don't belong somewhere, which everyone I talk to has this feeling. So why can't maybe we need to normalize that, and then we'll be able to connect and not feel disjointed internally and compare ourselves to this idea that I don't think, like you said, in today's world exists necessarily. It's such an interconnected world. I went to an international school with people who had like 3 nationalities, grew up in 5 different countries, and being in that space where everyone's going through the same thing did normalize it. But you sort of remind yourself that in 2025, which is crazy that we're in 2025, but
we're in 2025. I completely forgot. I thought you're talking about a future time. Okay.
But that's where we're at. So I think you're right that we have to. That's just the shared experience nowadays.
Yeah, I want to talk about Armenian community in Australia. I know Australia is obviously like geographically a pretty secluded country, right? It's far from everything else. Even though we live in a globalized world and social media and the connectivity is there, but how is the Armenian community in Australia different from Armenian community, let's say, in the States and the Armenian community in Armenia? Is there would you say there are distinct characteristics that are really typical for an Armenian community there?
Yeah, so I recently participated in this program with the Office of the High Commissioner of Diaspora, where I'm now the youth ambassador to Australia from Armenia. And we met people from basically 20 different countries. We spent about 2 weeks together. And there was a day there where everyone presented their communities. So what they're doing, what groups they have, how they operate. And basically, I felt outside of the countries that are, devastated by war, everyone's community is on some continuum. So they're in different places, but they're all quite similar, interestingly enough. So either the community sort of gathers around the church, which has been a fundamental sort of cultural preservation strategy. There's groups that have managed to separate and are ahead. I wouldn't say they're exactly like Kaitzak. Kaitzak has a bit of a different approach, but they're community groups, tied to a specific city that have gotten out of these older, more oppressive structures. So there's, youth groups in St. Petersburg that are absolutely thriving, that don't have much to do with the older, old political or religious groups. There was one theme which was pretty common, and we'd hear quite a lot, which was basically some certain certain groups within the communities, and I don't want to sound controversial. I'm just trying to say this as a matter of fact. There's certain divisions within the communities that are everywhere. They're all over the globe, to the point that when they were talking to me and we were sort of getting prepared to come back to Australia to start connecting Armenia to our respective cities, the scenarios that they were bringing up for us to think about were ones that I had already experienced. So people in Armenia who'd never been to Australia were already more knowledgeable about Australia's community than I was, just based on knowing other communities. So that was very, very interesting thing to understand. So in Australia, I think we have a largish community. People keep saying it's somewhere between 50 and 60,000. But when I check the census, which we do every few years in Australia, and it's pretty reliable, it said closer to 7 to 8,000. So not sure what that discrepancy is from. So I'm not sure. I'm sure other people would stand by that 60,000 number, but I'm not quite sure how they get to that number. The church obviously plays a big role. There's the sport groups, the dance groups, the choirs, AGBUs in, both Sydney and Melbourne. They just started their young professionals groups in both cities like a couple months ago. I'd say the key characteristic is that we have lots of groups and lots of them that don't work together. So there's no sort of unified leadership that's coming through. And there are countries like Germany, places like France that we really look to as an example of like community development. I think even they've tried to have these sort of, not pan-Armenian, but like pan-Armenian within France or within Germany to sort of tie all these groups together. So we're sort of in this research mode at the moment to figure out what strategies they've tried, what's worked and what hasn't worked. So Australia is not that different. It is far away. I think probably the main characteristic is that it's harder to fly to Armenia. So because of that distance that you mentioned before, our link with Armenia is probably a bit weaker, and you can see that with a full lack of representation of Armenia in Australia. So if you go on the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs website, you'll click on Armenia and it'll be like, Armenia is not represented in Australia. And you're like, oh, well, that's weird. Like, why is that the case? Yeah, like there are Armenians here. And I'm sure there's a lot of Armenian nationals that come to Australia or visit Australia. It's like you need these consulates or, honorary consuls and these types of roles that just haven't been filled. So that's another characteristic which I'm in the process of trying to understand why, I'm just on the beginning of that journey. So we're learning along the way. But yeah, that's Australian. Oh, and one more thing, Sydney's got a much more populous Armenian group than Melbourne does, but they sort of work in tandem. And there's some Armenians in Adelaide, in Perth, but they're generally not part of the Australia consensus. It's mostly Sydney and then Melbourne a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Okay. All right. Well, I want to know what's next for Kaitzak. What's your maybe a long-term vision for Kaitzak that you have right now? Obviously, it's going to change with time. Everything changes, right? Based on the experience that you gain, it's going to maybe shift a little bit. You may do some pivots, but what is your vision that you have right now?
Okay, vision. It's long-term. That's number one, very important, which is building healthier communities, diaspora communities, in a way, also contributing to the methods and the ways that communities will improve. So we want to be an organization that people can come to and be like, hey, we've got these problems. What have you learned about communities? What have you learned about mental health? What have you learnt about policy, governance, policy and governance structures that we can implement in our communities? And we want to be able to show them a bunch of case studies that we've gone through, and we've been like, look, we've done X, Y, Z in this place. It's worked in this place. Here's a city that's similar to your city, or here's a country that's similar to your country. You can try these things, or here are some suggestions that we can sort of help you work through. So I think overall it would be, you know, an organization that's just looking out for more communities at large, while at the same time taking care of the more sort of zoomed in grassroots aspect, which would be, you know, community consultations, you know, even like this is where the podcasts and the interviews and all that sort of online stuff comes into the picture. But we want to be sure that we can help create a cohesive goal. So the goal is to create a cohesive goal of health for everyone. And just getting that out there and making sure people know that that's an option. You don't have to, you know, live in suffering. You don't have to live in systems that don't work for you. We're in a time, and luckily in Australia, because a lot of other countries don't have this opportunity. In Australia, our government acts as an example, not all the time, and maybe now it's a bit contentious, but generally speaking, Australia displays some of the most advanced deliberative democracy techniques and puts those theories into practice mainly at a local level, but also at a state level. So there's no oppressive government in Australia that's going to come in and stop you doing whatever it is that you want to do. So people need to realize that that's a big deal. When I talk to my friends in other countries, I don't want to get them in trouble, but, you know, countries closer to Armenia, there's been times where, you know, they've literally been approached or stopped for doing certain community activities that the higher powers of that area don't want them to do. And that sort of coercive energy doesn't exist in Australia as strongly as it does overseas. So we want to take that and basically make sure that we can create strategies based on context that people can implement and grow and be more healthy. That was a bit long-winded, I feel. Yeah. Oh.
Well, it's a long-term vision, so it has to be long.
Precisely.
Anything to add, Mariam?
No, I think that's definitely what we're working towards, and something that Andre also touched upon. But this is something that really is critical for, you know, all community members, that we want people to start thinking, what story are we telling, and how can we move towards one that aligns with being, you know, supportive of each other's goals and being future focused without forgetting about the past? Because something that to sort of bring in that research piece, right? We all have collective narratives, group narratives that we share over and over again. And Kaitzak is a reminder that we also have a say in how that story gets told about us as individuals, as groups. And if we are able to create a united and strengths-focused narrative with a variety of, you know, means to do so, we can actually shift that narrative and create an empowering one where people do feel that they have a say. So that's I guess the behind the scenes theoretical framework that we want to employ to actualize what Andre is explaining from that structural policy angle. So again, you can see both of those things working in tandem to support each other. And it really depends on, which piece people want to plug into. Some people might be more interested in the more individual or micro scale, and some people might be really excited about these larger frameworks. So I think there's something for everyone at Kaitzak, and so long as people align with that philosophy to amplify the goodwill and generosity of other community members, we are definitely open to whatever comes from those collaborations.
Amazing. Thank you. It almost seems like you guys also have a think tank component in Kaitzak, which is like think tank for communities. Community think tank. Okay.
Yeah, no, spot on.
Play with that idea, but that's really, really cool. Thank you so much. This was super interesting to learn about your story, the story of Kaitzak, and I wish you good luck. I think that we all need a place and a platform to connect through positive stories, through stories that are encouraging and inspiring versus only the stories about loss, which also is important to talk about, but I think we don't have enough stories of inspiration and empowerment amongst the Armenian communities around the world globally. So I think that what you guys are doing is super cool. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for hosting us, for being such a great interviewer, and for the great questions. It was really inspiring for us to sort of bring our ideas and story together as well. It's always great to say it out loud and hear it actualize and see the timeline of how it's come together.
Yeah. Thanks. It's been great.
Thank you. That's how I felt when you, Andre, interviewed me. So thank you for that as well.
Yeah, no, awesome.